Hi, Mark Gilbert here. Thank you for clicking in on this video. What I want to talk with you today is about the idea of changing the world. Specifically, I want to get into four questions. The first one is, can we change the world? The second one is, should we change the world? The third one is, how do we change the world? And fourth is, if we're going to try to change the world, change it from what to what? Sounds like a lot to cover in a few minutes, but I think we can go through it rather succinctly. You know, the whole question of can we change the world came up in a discussion that my wife Mary and I were having last week. I said something as an aside about changing the world, and she said, you know, we really can't change the world. That led into a long conversation where at the end of it, I think we agreed to disagree on certain key points. But I think perhaps she won the discussion because she had the successful action of getting me to think about that question in terms of can we really change the world? Now, some of her key points, without getting into the whole discussion again, was that this world is going to continue on, and all the efforts that we do to change things aren't really going to change the Earth. The Earth will continue long beyond the time that the species of humanity leaves the planet. The Earth will continue to exist in some form or fashion. And I think the other point that she was trying to make is that we're moving through dimensions, and that in this third dimensional experience that we're having here on Earth, we may be called to be a change agent and do something that's going to make change, but it doesn't ultimately change the third dimension. That what we end up doing is changing our own consciousness, and in that perhaps moving to another dimension within ourselves. So without putting words in her mouth, what that led to was a sense that, well, it depends on what you mean by changing the world. And I think if we get down into the common vernacular of it, maybe we think we can change the world. However, I want to share a quote from spiritual teacher Ernest Holmes, someone who is very influential in my life. And he wrote the following about making changes. He says, "It's quite a burden lifted when we realize that we do not have to move the world. It's going to move anyway. This realization does not lessen our duty or our social obligation. It clarifies it." In a sense, I think Holmes is probably agreeing with Mary in this, that our efforts to change the world aren't going to move the world. The world is going to continue moving as it is. But that doesn't mean we don't feel the call to social obligations. And I think many of us feel those calls. And in fulfilling the call to social obligation and expressing ourselves in this third dimensional experience, we have a sense that, or a desire that we're changing the world. So, can we change the world? I'm going to leave that question open. I think it depends on your definition of what you're doing when you change the world. But for now, let's acknowledge that we do feel this sense of social obligation to make a difference for those around us. That brings us to the second question, and that's, should we change the world? Now, I will cut to the chase and say that I believe there is something in us that's called to social action. In fact, this is a key point of a series of 3 books I wrote a number of years ago. The first book was entitled Our Spiritual Evolution, and it covered what I saw as the key concepts of the spiritual evolutionary journey that we're on, and that I've explained in a number of other videos. That book led into a second book that was entitled Our Spiritual Rights and Responsibilities, where it basically said if we come to grips with the fact that we're on this spiritual evolutionary journey, our return in consciousness to a sense of oneness and knowing that we're all interconnected, that wisdom, that knowledge comes with a sense of some rights and some responsibilities. And that book outlined those. And finally, all of that led to a culmination in the sense of becoming a spiritual change agent, and the book by that title, Becoming a Spiritual Change Agent. Now, what did I mean by a spiritual change agent? I think we sort of know what we mean by change agent, but from a sense of a spiritual change agent, I actually defined it as something that had 5 characteristics to it. Let me read these real quickly. It's someone who has the power to act. Secondly, they're focused upon the possibilities of a positive change for the future. Third, they're actively engaged in creating that future. Fourth, they're leading others within their sphere of influence towards that change. And fifth, the change fosters our relationship with a divine transcendent power and presence. Now, What I was getting at in that definition is that we have a calling, we have a vision, we know what we want to do, we see it as creating positive change, and we see it also in the context of being connected to everything. Again, tying back to recognizing that we're on that spiritual evolutionary journey and have these rights and responsibilities as a spiritual being having this human experience. So should we? I believe we should. I believe that we should take action where we're called in our social obligations to be a positive change for the planet. I think most of us look out at the world out there and we see a gap between the world that we believe is possible and the world that we're currently existing. And in that gap, we wish to close it. We wish to make the changes and be the change that is going to allow us to move into that world that we know is possible. So if we're looking at the first two questions as being answered in the affirmative, then that brings us to the third question of how can we change the world? And a little bit of that answer was given to you in the definition of a spiritual change agent, in the sense that it begins with us as an individual, that we have to take action in our particular sphere of influence. In the words of Gandhi, we need to be the change we wish to see in the world. And being is an aspect of inner change as well as outer expression. To be the change involves us embodying a recognition of that which we wish to see, and it changes in our awareness, in our thoughts, in our consciousness. We begin with that inner awareness of consciously changing ourselves to see the world that we wish to be in. We use the power of affirmations and affirmative prayer and other positive thinking, law of attraction techniques that I've discussed in other videos to shift ourselves to becoming that which we wish to see. And the becoming is a change in our thoughts, in what we say, and in what we do in the world, in a consistent way that basically also overlays our subconscious and any collective conscious control that might be over us that says those are not possible. So what do we mean by a sphere of influence? You know, I got this term from Stephen Covey in his famous book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of the many ideas that really took off in me when I first read that book. But in that book, he talks about we have an area of control. You might imagine this is like a bubble around us. And within that bubble, we have some influence. Now, where do we have the most influence? It's within ourselves. It's within our own thoughts and then the words and deeds that follow from our thoughts. So what's in our sphere? It's certainly us. But oftentimes, we can influence others. Perhaps I'm influencing you through this video. Perhaps you're influencing me by writing me or communicating with me. Perhaps I'm influenced by others on TV. Perhaps you're influenced by others in certain circumstances. We bump into people all the time in their spheres of influence, and we are impacted by it. If their message or what they're doing resonates with us, we may learn something from us and be influenced by that action. So we're all these individual pockets of consciousness with spheres of influence around us that we're bumping into one another and learning and growing through each other. And so that's what we mean by a sphere of influence. You know, we all have heard the famous statement from Margaret Mead, and let me read it to make sure I get it right. She says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." We all know that at some level, that it doesn't have to be a mass movement, that every change that we look back at and point at as being something that was a major shift started with a few individuals. That gets me to another concept, one of Rupert Sheldrake's Morphogenesis fields. What he says, and I'm not going to take a lot of time describing this, but I want you to get the concept that he says that there is a field of energy out there, a field or patterns that we tap into that are influencing us and can be influenced by us. That these morphogenic fields can be created through the thoughts of a few people. And if it doesn't have to be a mass movement that allows hundreds of thousands of people to have to move to something, it can be a few people that have put something into this field and it dissipates through the field into other people. For example, you could say the videos on this YouTube channel aren't watched by as many people as they should be if we're really going to make a mass influence upon the planet. On one level, that's true, and there's nothing wrong with having lots of Twitter followers and lots of YouTube views. But on the other hand, something that is put out in the field, influencing maybe one or two people, a handful of people who are influencing other people, can lead to changing the world. So it's not always about numbers and size. Sometimes it's about doing the right thing and putting it into that field of possibilities and allowing that to flow energetically and impact others. So all of this leads us to the final question of change from what to what. That question was sort of inherent when we talked about changing our consciousness a few minutes ago, because the first step in that was identifying what we wanted to create. So how do we identify what we want to create? What is it out there that we wish to see that we're not currently experiencing that we're identifying as a gap? It's in that identification of what we wish to see that is the world that we wish to create. Where do we get that information from? Well, there's a lot of things that we can do to have those identify into our awareness. One of the things we can do is a process called visioning, which you can read about online. I'm going to be doing a video about it soon. In that process, you are asking for higher guidance as to what is it that you wish to see in the world. Another way you can get this is through meditation. Just sit quietly and ask the question, contemplate on what is it that you wish to see in the world. Also through discussions with others. Sometimes you have to look at what are you getting emotionally reacted to in terms of the world. Where is it that you're being called and pushed to be an agent of change for something? So there is this bigger issue of what is it that you wish to see and create. And then there's a secondary issue to that is what is it yours to create in that? And although we might have this gigantic description of all the changes in the world that we'd like to see, that we think would be a world that works for everyone, there might be only certain parts of it that we feel like our talents and our abilities are the key ones that are needed at this time to bring about that change. That's not to say that we can't use positive thinking, affirmative prayer, and things of those natures to affirm that the world that we wish to see is being created. But when it gets down to where we're actually called to be a change agent, to take that social action that we described earlier, that's where we have to also look at our talents and gifts, those special abilities that we came onto the planet with, and where they're in alignment with the world that we wish to create. I hope this has given you some ideas for changing the world. I guess what I would ask you to consider in this point is, where are you called to make changes? What is it that's out there that is less than or different from what your current experience is? What is it in your life that's your talents and gifts that call you to be an agent of change, to fulfill your social obligations, to express your creative abilities in this third dimension worldly experience in a manner that is going to lead to the creation of that world that you desire? Those are questions for you to contemplate. I hope you found this beneficial. Thanks for viewing. Till next time. Hey, one more quick thing. I'd love it if you subscribe to the channel. The link is down there on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Also, there's a related video you might want to watch. It's right next to my face. And if you like this video, be sure to click like and leave me a comment on YouTube. Thanks.